Hello everybody, this is Rob, and I'm going to go over Chapter 3 today. I'm traveling, so for those of you used to the face-to-face class, this is instead of the face-to-face lecture. I would really appreciate your feedback, both from the face-to-face people and the non-face-to-face people. Let me know if you think this is a good tool for you, because I can keep doing it if you think it's useful. So my goal is to get through Chapter 3. I'm going to do slides. There's a lot of them. This particular chapter is, I think, one of the most interesting in the book. So I highly recommend you read it. I recommend you read all of them, but this one is particularly interesting. So I'm going to go through the slides. I also want to do a brief overview for the quiz, Chapter 3 quiz. I know some of you have already taken it, but for those of you who haven't, this should be helpful. And then I also want to show you an example of a causal loop analysis based on information in Chapter 3. So I'll be moving around a little bit, tend to talk with my hands. I've got my laptop here with slides on it, so that's what I'll be referring to. And here we go. So I'm heading down to slide number 3, and the goal is I want to give you a historical perspective of healthcare development or health service provision development in our country, going back to the 1800s all the way through today, and give you an idea of, or at least an understanding, hopefully an overview and understanding on how our delivery system is developed and why it's different here than it is in other countries. And also to give a bit of a historical perspective on the Affordable Care Act, because the Affordable Care Act is a wonderful example of a result or an indication that we're in the fourth era of healthcare in our country, which is healthcare reform in the way of greater governmental influence. So in Chapter 2 we talked about I'm on slide 4. In Chapter 2 we talked about the healthcare system's been shaped by cultural values and social and political and economic influences. It still is. We're a capitalistic country, and almost everything that goes on in the United States has a business connection to it, which means there's an economic connection to it. There have been a number of attempts to have a national healthcare program going back decades, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but it just has not made inroads. There has been some, I guess, success in programs like Medicare and Medicaid and Veterans Affairs, and even the Affordable Care Act is an example of a successful nationalization of a particular function. But it's been, success up to this point has really been around programs, not the whole system in the whole country. Now I'm on slide 6. Another thing that's been very influential in our healthcare system is medical technology. Our country, when the country started, we didn't have any organized medicine, and everybody pretty much started from scratch or brought bits and pieces from their country of origin, and we've been advancing from that point since. So we live in a country, the United States, where we do have access to the very best medical technology. The cool gadgets, the great pharmaceuticals, the wonderful procedural environments, and wonderful medical education, but access to that, and access in such a way that everybody can have the same level of access, just hasn't been reached. Technology and science has played a major role not only in the specialization of physicians and providers, like hospitals and other practitioners, but it's also had a big influence on our medical education, and we'll talk about that as well. So now I'm on slide number 7. Slide number 7 is a very important important slide. It's the one that has the four main eras of healthcare evolution. We have the pre-industrial, the post-industrial, corporatization, and then healthcare reform. And I'm going to go through each of those through the slides as we go forward. So this is a good one just to put it into perspective based on timing. So pre-industrial, it's 17 and 1800s. So there wasn't much going on in the United States in an organized fashion. People, coming in, Christopher Columbus, and there are theories that other folks were coming here, but medical care and medical practice, there wasn't anything. It was really in disarray or non-array because it wasn't organized at all. Those that were practicing medicine were really tradespeople. If you think of, well, I don't know if you knew this, but Dr. Pepper, Coca-Cola, things like that, those were elixirs. Medical practitioners they came and they made elixirs and they sold them because they made people feel better. And now they're soft drinks, but that's an example of what the profession was like back then. As far as procedures go, they were very, very primitive. Surgery was basically amputation or sewing someone up or trying to sew someone up after they, got gouged by a wild boar or hurt themselves in some way. There were some things that went on, things like bleeding and emetics, things that make you vomit, or purgatives, things that would cleanse your system. But it was really based on consuming things and getting a result, or external forces. So you think of leeches and things like that. But it wasn't high-tech medicine that we think of today. As far as institutions go, by default there were some medical institutions, almshouses, dispensaries, mental asylums. They were the default healthcare provider organizations of the day. So let's take it through. So almshouse or a poorhouse. So you're a farmer or you're a business person working in a rural town, and you get sick or get injured and you can't maintain your store or maintain your farm, and you become destitute. Well, there were almshouses or poorhouses, usually supported by communities or religious communities. They would take in the poor, and it turned out that they were taking in the poor and the sick. And over time, as the populations got bigger and bigger of each, it just made sense to segregate the population. So once they started seeing patterns of disease and things like that, but there wasn't an organized function like today's hospital system or anything like that. In general, demand for healthcare services, if you were the consumer, it was a true market system back then. If you needed service, you sought out a provider of some sort, and you figured out how to pay them out of your own pocket. It was very much consumer focused. Again, except for the elixirs and things like that, the old doc whatever would come and try to drum up some business, but for the most part, healthcare was on an as-needed basis, and the consumer would go seek it out. And there wasn't any formal medical education back then. It was all people would come from another country, and maybe they were a doctor, they'd come from another country and they'd travel around and try to help people. But if you wanted to become a doctor or sell the elixirs, generally it was an apprenticeship program. So you'd sign on with someone for a while, they'd train you, whatever that meant, and then you were ready to go off on your own, and then some agreement was made where perhaps you'd either do it alongside them or you'd go to a different town so you wouldn't compete. But really it was a medical apprenticeship type system back then, nothing formal. On page 9, we move into the post-industrial era, which is the late 1800s into the 1900s, and that's where physicians started to gain some credibility and sovereignty, and that's a big word. So sovereignty, big. I didn't mean to be patronizing, but big word is in. They really started to feel their own self-importance. Remember, some of these folks coming from England, in particular, they come from a nationalized health program where the king, back in feudal times in the hundreds and early hundreds, a king or a landlord would have take responsibility or ownership of a particular piece of land, and then they'd start farming it or have animals or something like that, and they'd need help. Well, they'd bring on people to help them, and there was a give and take, that you come and work my land and I'll give you some of the food and you can live there and it's all a happy day. And then imagine that that builds into kingdoms with castles and walls and moats and stuff like that, but still the king takes responsibility. There, over the thousands of years that England's government has developed, responsibility for healthcare just became a natural part of it, that a king or a land baron of some sort would take responsibility for the health of the people living on the land, working for them, because it just made sense. The king couldn't do it themselves, so it just made sense to help them, keep them healthy, get them back working. And it became just part of the social or governmental contract, and it never went away. And that's part of the reason why England has a nationalized health program even today. The United States didn't have that. So you have physicians coming from England over here realizing, they're going to make a go of it on their own. They're not working for anybody but themselves. The only thing that's limiting them is how industrious they are. And after a couple hundred years, enough doctors were over here, and they're starting to train their own apprentices, that they start to have enough numbers and enough influence to really develop their own sovereignty, really, around the industry. And because of that, at the very earliest stages, physicians didn't want nationalized health care because it would have limited their ascent to power. And it's a great list right there on slide 9, where urbanization, science and technology, institutionalization, patient dependence, autonomy and organization, licensing and educational reform, all the physicians themselves took control of all of, well, not urbanization, but definitely other ones, for the purpose of maintaining the authority and the social and the economic position or strength of their group of physicians. And that's had a huge influence on the United States. So you think about it, they saw it as a business. It's capitalism. Coming to a new country, no taxation without representation. That the American dream, that if you work hard enough, you can achieve something. This is a perfect example of it, and the physicians were driving it. We'll go forward with it, but hospitals came, and at the same time, remember, employers are coming. So way back into the 1800s and the 1900s, hopefully you can see this. For those of you that are in the face-to-face class, you'll recognize it. This is where, that's a triangle. Hopefully you can see it. Here, let me zoom in a little bit. That physicians wanted to stay on top of the pyramid, so to speak. And coming behind them, you still have hospitals, and you have employers. Because hospitals and employers also, make this smaller, hospitals and employers are also those that were in business. You know, they were trying to develop something too. And then folks that, you know, almshouses and things like that, the default hospitals, as we were talking about before, realized that they needed to organize and figure out how to help take care of the people that were ending up in their care. So that's never gone away. So we'll come back to that. But again, physicians had a huge impact on what was going on because they, by default, were the sovereign leaders of healthcare in our country. There were more of them. They started to organize, and we'll move forward on some of the slides about that. Urbanization. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Again, it's very interesting. I highly suggest you read the book, but urbanization had a big impact on maintaining the power and authority of physicians. People were being forced to move away from home, or they were working. Women were entering the workforce. Physicians, as they organized, it became easier to become a physician through through medical education, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Because at first there was no medical education, and then physicians realized, hey, I can make money at providing medical education. Then all of a sudden there was a huge explosion of medical education in our country, right in the pre-industrial area. And it was really out of hand. There were thousands of medical schools, as they called them, or organized apprentice programs. And it was out of control, but there was no standardization around it. So that for a period of time, the opportunity cost was really, really low for people to get into medicine. It was easy to get into medicine. It didn't cost much, and you could start trading your services for lots of chickens or money or whatever, and make a pretty good living at it. And physicians were getting better at it as well, so that helped. So on to slide 11, science and technology also helped in that as the Industrial Revolution was coming on, we were learning more and more about medicine and ourselves, and there's a great subsection in there, and we'll go over it really quickly, but on some of the cool things that were discovered, like anesthesia and disinfectants and stuff like that. But science started to recognize things that physicians just grasped onto and took control of, and that reinforced their position of authority, again, their sovereignty, so to speak. And in general, the non-medical people, the patients, recognize that, physicians really know something, and they make people feel better, or help them through a disease. Maybe they don't even feel better, but at least they live. And physicians recognized early that there was power and authority in that, and they hung on to it like crazy, which then increased the demand for their services, which made them more successful and more popular, and reinforced their sovereignty. And it's, again, a cycle. And this is a preview. This is the causal loop that I'm going to use as an example toward the end of the lecture. Excuse me. So on slide number 10, there are some groundbreaking medical discoveries in the late 1800s and the early 1900s that the physicians grasped onto and took control of, and helped reinforce their sovereignty and their importance in being the pinnacle of medical provision in our country. In 1846, anesthesia. Up until that point, up until 1846, people who needed something amputated or a bullet taken out, or they impaled themselves on a stick or something like that, you see it in movies and things like that, but it's not. It's true. They get them really drunk. Maybe they knock them out, but there wasn't a formal, safe, predictable anesthesia to to help people through those things. So the ability through ether to put someone to sleep so they don't remember or feel the pain was a huge step forward, especially for the surgeons, because it became a little less risky when your patient wouldn't jump off the table and try to defend themselves when you're trying to help them. 1847, quickly after anesthesia, antiseptic techniques, that's when germ theory started to develop, and people recognized that, hey, maybe we should keep our hands clean or instruments clean when we go from patient to patient. That was revolutionary and evolutionary in keeping people alive. So washing your hands. And then 1860, sterilization, not just killing the germs after the fact, cleaning things really well. Then honest-to-goodness sterilization was recognized to be a good thing, and doing it by heat as well as by chemicals. If you think about it, people just didn't know better that if you're thinking, World War I or skirmishes or the Civil War, physicians would have a scalpel or a saw or something, and they'd just go table to table to table. So if, poor Ed was sick and you cut off his leg and then you go over because it, got mangled or something like that, and then they'd take that same saw and walk over to, Jimmy and cut off his arm with the same saw. And again, you're spreading disease and all along the ways. So that's 1860s. And then in 1895, X-ray imaging, being able to take a picture, they realized there were radioactive elements. You could take a picture of a bone. So perhaps instead of cutting off a broken leg or just bandaging a broken leg, you could look at it and say, oh, okay, it's kind of bent funny, figure it out and straighten it, and then bandage it. Things like that, looking inside and seeing the bones was a big deal. 1929, penicillin, the first antibiotic, was revolutionary. Again, killing the bugs on the inside and infection without having to open them up or use leeches or something like that. So that slide number 12 is pretty interesting. I recommend you take a look at it. So going back to professional sovereignty and aspects of, I'm on slide number 13, institutionalization. We're in post-industrial era, so we're in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Cities are starting to grow in importance in our country. East Coast, there's development all along the East Coast, and there's a natural pooling of expertise and people and money and things like that in towns. And medical people, much like the ancient libraries of like Mesopotamia and things like that, where bodies of knowledge were held, and there were crossroads in those faraway countries where people with information to share or information that they wanted would come to these places, and they would share that was happening right here in our country. And people started to share it and share the resources and share the information. The hospital, almshouses were evolving into hospitals. The pooling of resource, if you think about it, that you have poor people and then you have sick people, and the poor people in the almshouse had to be there because they were poor, but they realized that those sick people, they're just going to get us sick. So there was a push from the inside for, hey, are these almshouses the right places for sick people? Well, it turned out not necessarily. And also, physicians recognized that in order to get lots of practice, you could go to where there were sick people already pooling, and that was the hospital concept. Way back then, physicians used to pay the hospitals to allow them to come in and practice on the patients. Way different than today. Today, the hospitals pay the physicians, or insurance companies pay the physicians to come and care and practice on the people. But back then, if you were a physician or you were an apprentice physician, you would have to pay the hospital to go and treat people. Think of it as like rent or room and board for the patient. but it's flipped. With sovereignty and the importance of the increase in sovereignty and the importance of physicians increasing, it's started to flip the other way. So the hospital became the institutional core of healthcare delivery because it was the hub. It's where all the sick people were, and physicians just kept coming to the hub to do that, and dependencies were created on that. So again, think about it. This is all a plain or blank canvas, and we're building it from the ground up in our country. Society, people, patients started to have the expectation that if they go to a hospital or they go talk to a doctor, that they're going to get better. That's a flip for a while. Going to an almshouse because you were sick, or getting rid of Uncle Ed, who we couldn't handle anymore. It was we're getting him out of our hair. Now people were starting to seek healthcare with the expectation that they're going to get well, and when they started getting well, that again contributed to the power and the sovereignty of the physician. I erased it, but at the top of that pyramid. So it's really in that post-industrial era that physicians locked in on their cultural role and their cultural role of an authoritative figure, socially authoritative, physically authoritative, and economically authoritative, because they were developing the business around it as they were going. So all three, and again, not encumbered by the historical feudal nationalized health system or expectation of government that basically put you in a track and you stayed in your track. It was a free-for-all here in the United States. So now I'm on slide 14. So physicians intensely wanted to remain autonomous. They didn't want to be part of a nationalized program from the beginning. So physicians started to organize among themselves, and then they started to organize the organizations that educate themselves, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Again, on slide 14, we talk about that, is that physicians intentionally, while they actually started to try to own and organize the hospital, then hospitals got started to say, hey, I don't want to be controlled by these guys. And at the same time, as medicine was growing as a business, businesses were growing as a business, so there was an influence to have corporate control too. So back in this time, this isn't in the slides, but it's sort of a fun fact. Andrew Carnegie, or Andrew Carnegie, depending on how you want to say it, one of the preeminent steel barons of the industrial age, building railroads and building machines across the country. Well, one of the first people, we'll talk about Baylor and teachers down in Texas in a second, but Carnegie is an example, starting from the East Coast, would make healthcare available to the workers on the railroads, because you send workers out to lay track. It's hard work, dangerous work. People get hurt. Well, if they're not dead, it became in Carnegie's best interest, in the industry's best interest, to get that person healthy again so they can go back to work. And it just made sense because they couldn't afford it for Carnegie to provide healthcare services. So it wasn't really formal or anything, but Carnegie would provide healthcare services to his workers to keep them working. And again, going forward, we'll talk about it in a sec, but physicians, and in that way, they owned everything. So there's an example of Carnegie would try to buy a physician and send a physician out to the railroads, but physicians were fiercely independent in our country. Almost everybody was fiercely independent in our country, and they wanted to manage their own future. So they resisted that. They resisted that corporate takeover mentality of being owned by someone, because it was a few years since people came over on the boat from England, but they're still very sensitive and aware of where they came from, where the government or the king or the queen controlled everything and controlled how much they could make and where they could practice and all sorts of stuff. And people in the United States did not want that. And physicians are a great example where they grabbed on to their independence and just did not let it go. Physicians resisted organized medicine the best that they could, and corporate control and corporate practice doctrine. So what they did, though, is they organized themselves into the American Medical Association. So they banded together as a group because, strength in numbers, and it happens over and over and all the time, even today in our country, that the American Medical Association was an association of physicians that was set up really to look out for the interests of physicians. Now, they've done some great things too, where they standardized medical education, and that led to the standardization of medical schools and the certification and regulation and maintenance of standards for hospitals as well. But originally, the American Medical Association was set up to look out for the interests of the docs. And they came up with their own method of licensing themselves. And that was where the Medical Practice Acts of the 1870s came from, where physicians organized and said, okay, this is what it takes to be considered a good physician, to get a license to practice. And they then standardized what it would take to get that kind of education. And if you remember, just a few minutes ago I talked about that there was an explosion of medical schools. There was Dr. Jake's medical school down the street and Harvard Medical School over there and whatever over there. But the most influential and the most powerful got together and standardized, and the American Medical Association helped them. And we'll see it in just a second, but then there was a relatively rapid reduction in the number of medical schools because it became the standard of practice to get a license based on a standardized education to practice medicine and call yourself a physician. So physicians organize themselves economically and regulatorily, if that's the right word, by setting standards, and then they self-manage themselves. They didn't wait for the government to do it. And then also they insulated themselves corporately by maintaining their sovereignty. Which again, going back to that triangle that I had written, remember, physicians, hospitals, employers, they were really smart on how they self-organized to do that. So now I'm moving on to slide number 15. So, educational reform. I have to remember to read. The AMA, the doctors that were at Harvard Medical School and Johns Hopkins Medical School had been talking and collaborating for years. And they got together with the help of the AMA and they standardized medical education. And what they did is they standardized what a laboratory experience would look like, what sciences should be studied, and how to test people on whether or not they had a grasp of the information and the knowledge. And it was through those steps that lesser medical schools were weaned out. The proprietary schools, the private schools that couldn't keep up with it, they just couldn't compete with the likes of Harvard and Johns Hopkins, and they just went out of business. So the AMA's control over medical education, which at that time was called the Council on Medical Education, ruled out, just totally trumped them. And they formalized and standardized the effort through something called the Flexner project, where for a period of time, it ended in 1910, that's when the report was shared, but people went out and organized and they evaluated all these medical schools. And that's, using that information, a group of learned physicians, a part of the Council on Medical Education, sifted through that stuff and set the standards. And it was through that if your school could meet the standards, then you could be an AMA accredited program. It sounds very familiar to what happens today, doesn't it? Even with hospitals or clinics or labs. It goes all the way back to the early 1900s. And the Flexner report was the 400-pound gorilla report that came out and really reduced the number of active medical schools at the given time. So back then, in the early 1900s, I'm on slide number 16, even back then, physicians were realizing that it was easier to specialize in things as opposed to just being a general practitioner. And with technology and social pressure and the freedom to pursue what you thought was interesting, that fueled specialization in our country, and that it's never stopped. So unlike in Britain, the U.S. didn't develop around a nucleus of primary care. Britain, again, to keep farmers farming and keep workers working and all that kind of stuff, they focused on primary care, and they, for lack of a better term, rationed or controlled access to the super specialties, because from a centralized governmental control with one pot of money to spend on this, the government couldn't afford to put the super expensive stuff everywhere. So there was a natural focus on the primary care stuff, and then they had the latest and greatest and the best available, but maybe you had to wait for it. So you had to figure out, did you really need it or not? Again, the government had a say in that from the earliest time, and it's never been that way in the United States. A physician in the United States was developing their own business along the way without any governmental impact or control. And if they wanted to continue to specialize, they could. Even today, which is interesting, you can be a physician and call yourself a specialist. You can be a primary care doc, you can be whatever doc, and be a specialist in whatever you want. And you can even put that on the sign above your door. But what you can't do is call yourself a board certified specialist in something. It takes that extra level education in order to be able to say you're board certified. But even today, primary care can specialize in stuff, and you might find it if bariatrics, I guess that's a big one. I'm drawing a blank on a few others, but there are examples where a physician who was trained in one thing ultimately becomes a specialist in something else, but they can't call themselves board certified. Now, what's interesting is that through regulation and legislation and market influence, there's been an attempt, because specialization or training a specialist is really expensive. They cost more than primary care. Not telling you something you don't already know, but managed care or managed cost has really had the most effect on. The government and organizations realized, and insurance companies realized that you can't give everybody, you can't afford to send everybody to the highest and highest paid and most expensive specialists just off the get-go. And the HMO, the Health Maintenance Organization, is an example of a model that was put into place that used the gatekeeper model, the gatekeeper being the primary care physician, to help slow down or help provide an appropriate level of care to a patient before they move up the ladder to the specialists. But specialists didn't like that very much, and I guess we could have a whole class on HMO development, but we won't. So now on slide 17, I'm just popping into, we're going to talk a little bit about mental health. I know I'm a little bit all over the place, but the National Mental Health Act of 1946 was a governmental action where the federal government put money specifically into education and research for mental health. The incidence and prevalence of mental disorders, for lack of a better term, because it wasn't really understood as a disease yet, lots of money went into that. And early treatment of medical disorders was the goal, trying to get people safe. And then the Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963 was an effort to get the government out of the business of mental health hospitals. So it was a shifting of funding from inpatient mental health facilities or asylums to community-based programming. And Olmsted versus LC, and I think that was the early 70s, was a push to deinstitutionalize people. People in mental health hospitals were identified as a class of people, much like a socioeconomic class or a racial class, and it was thought of at the time that those folks, these are the words that were used, were being imprisoned in mental health institutions against their will, and that they need to be freed, and that the thought was, especially with the advances of psychotropic drugs, they seem to hold great promise, and some talk therapies, that these folks could be deinstitutionalized, could be let go, released, with the thought that they could then come back for day treatments and medications in order to keep them healthy. Well, for many that worked really well, but for some it didn't. So it's just a piece of history. Now on slide 18, we're talking about public health. Public health in the U.S. developed in response to deadly outbreaks of communicable diseases. Private practice, again, was on a roar. They're just, people were in private practice, and privately practicing physicians, it's not that they didn't care about public health, but it wasn't in their own self-interest for them to focus on keeping big groups of population healthy. Economic incentives, social incentives were to treat patients on a one-on-one basis, not worry about malaria or the plague or anything like that. So public health was developed in response to really the private practice side of it not taking an interest in addressing the root causes of and the spreading of communicable diseases over great numbers of population. It just was. So when you're thinking of public health, it focuses on the whole group, not the individual. Veteran services, health services. After World War I, the government realized that, we got a lot of folks coming back from war with lots of health issues. So the VA was formed, and it moved from, when it first originated, the government would pay private physicians to care for wounded soldiers, but the government, in an effort to control cost and control quality and provide a consistent level of service, got into it and started to open their own facilities managed by the Department of Veterans Affairs. That's an example of nationalized healthcare, but it's for veterans, so it's for a subset of the general population. On slide number 20, way back, it talks about workers' compensation, and workers' compensation was started out as if you look at the history books, 1914, the country is just going gangbusters. We're building stuff and building business and roads, and there wasn't as much governmental and socialized or nationalized health system components. It wasn't organized well at all. But corporations and businesses or employers were pretty well organized around, especially around whatever their business was. So think of Henry Ford. Henry Ford did a wonderful job of horizontally and vertically integrating the automotive industry. And he employed tens and tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of people. And it just became good business for Henry Ford and Ford Motor Company to take on the responsibility of providing health services for the employees. Sound familiar? Very similar to kings in feudal England. But it's different. It's a business, self-made business person, not some lord or duchess or princess or queen, who inherited it because of family. It was driven by business. So work-related injuries and illnesses by default became the responsibility of the employer, regardless of whose fault it was. Did the worker out of stupidity hurt themselves? Well, it didn't matter. They were employed. The employer wanted to keep them working, so it became their responsibility. The government saw this as an opportunity way back in 1914, and they used it as a trial balloon for government-sponsored health insurance in the United States. The government went to these big employers and said, look, you're already responsible. You've taken responsibility for your workers. Transfer that responsibility to the government, and we'll keep it going, regardless of whether or not that employee continues to work for you or goes and works somewhere else. Employers said no. They didn't like it. And also, at the same time, a whole nother business was rearing its head, and that was the private health insurance industry. So now all of a sudden, people saw that there was an opportunity to make some money and build a business by insuring populations. So all of a sudden the government, well, even back then, the government who wanted to take responsibility and build it into the economy and make sure that people had access to services, they then started to compete with private businesses that saw it as a business. And again, this is the new world, built on the American dream of, build it yourself, better, stronger, faster, work really hard. The government didn't win. Going back to the last chapter, the cultural beliefs and desires and economies and all that philosophy continue to support the private interest of individuals, and in this case, individual corporations, for self-made people, as opposed to giving it to a public entity. So private health insurance, with the support of employers, really thwarted that early effort for nationalized health care. So now think back, not that you were there, but 1914, lots of stuff going on. Lots of people employed. The country's doing pretty well. Huge advances in technology, and I'm now on slide 21. Huge advances in technology and individuals' acknowledgement and desire to get better when they go to the doctor. So social desirability of medical treatments, and just the economic uncertainty of certain diseases were the forces driving the growth of private health insurance in our country. Even today, today, if you look at the situation today, it's similar to the situation back then, is that if people carry health insurance today primarily through their employer, really for fear that something bad will happen. Like, I stand before you, my health insurance is really expensive. It runs about $1,700 a month. And then I have a high deductible, and I get it through my employer, like almost everybody else does. But sure, if I'd sock that money away, after the course of a year, 1,700 times 12, you can do the math. It sounds like a lot of money. But if I have a heart attack or I need a replacement or something really bad happens, that would wipe me out. There's just that risk of something catastrophic happening fuels people's purchase of insurance, because that's what insurance is. Like your car insurance, you pay car insurance hoping you never have to use it, but at least even in the state of Wisconsin, that you have insurance, no fault insurance, or so it's optional if you take out insurance to cover your car that's damaged in an accident, but it's mandatory that you have insurance to cover the other person, at least their medical and their car insurance. But you take that because in general, the risk is so high that if you would hit someone or whatever, you may not, you might not have enough cash to cover it, nor will people necessarily want to cover it. So it's truly, health insurance or insurance against a catastrophic event. So technology, social desirability, and then economic demands are what continue to drive the need or desire for health insurance. So in 1911, I'm now on slide 22, blanket insurance policies became available. So remember 1914, where workers' comp was coming in, so the insurance is starting to happen, and it's a 3 to 5 year period where this is all vogue, and people say, well, the government's like, well, we'll just get into the insurance business and we'll take it from here and build it into the tax structure and stuff like that. No, it didn't work. State employer mandates, so where the state mandated and the employers have it, that failed, again, through private pressure. So between basically 1910 and 1929, there was a period of time where you had a bunch of stuff going on. The government was trying really, really hard to do nationalized health service coverage, and consumers were fighting it a little, and businesses were fighting it, and finally J.F. Kimball at Baylor University Hospital in Texas just was the first one on record to formalize prepaid modern health insurance for their teachers, and that became the model for Blue Cross. And Blue Cross would cover hospitals because physicians didn't want anything to do with that scary insurance stuff. You just pay us as we go. But eventually, 10 years later, the California Medical Association adopted the Blue Cross model for physicians in California, which that became Blue Shield, and then physicians covered under insurance really became the norm. But fun fact on the side, Baylor University and teachers down in Texas, in the early 1900s, Texas was wide open, and there were a lot of oil workers and ranchers and down there, and they needed workers, and they needed generally men to come and work, and they did. But in general, what do men need or want? Well, women. Okay, so then you get women to come down, and when men and women get together, babies happen, and then they have children, and in order to keep people working, they realize the value of education, and Baylor University, through the Educational Association down there, wanted to attract teachers, which for the most part were mostly women too, so it served two purposes. Created this insurance program that covered hospitalization for teachers at Baylor University Hospital in order to keep teachers in the area, so that men could marry them, or they'd stay and keep working, and then when they had children, that there was a structure to educate them, the children. So its own little system down there. So that's just a fun fact. So now I'm on slide number 23. So World War II caused wage freezes. I talked about this a little bit earlier. If you owned a business during World War II, you could not increase wages. It was for the national good. But they started to include health insurance in lieu of wage increases. So that was the origination, the time when the employees really became insulated from the actual cost of healthcare. I can't remember if the book says it in there, but that's a poignant point. Way back in World War II, there was a disconnect, and that's really what the final separation or the disintegration or destroying of an actual system in our country happened, is that we, the consumers, were getting our health benefits through employers, were now completely insulated from the actual cost. So if we had coverage, we'd go get a service, regardless of the cost. And employers would just cover it because they needed workers. And it just went on from there. In 1948, the Supreme Court legitimized health insurance as a negotiable item in union management bargaining. So basically what that did is, again, 1948, unions very powerful. The government said healthcare benefits just as good as money, just as valuable as money, and it became something that unions could negotiate for, much like wages for their members. And then in 1954, the government said that employers who contributed toward the health insurance costs for their employees, that they could write that off on their taxes. So they could reduce their taxable income by contributing to the health benefits of their employees. So they became exempt from taxable income for the employer and for the employee, which again locked it in. So it was a confluence of events. Those are some pretty big things in our history. So on slide number 24, we talk a little bit about things that had happened in the United States, that national health insurance actions. In 1914, workers' compensation was a first effort at nationalized health insurance that got thwarted. In 1917, the American Association of Labor legislation attempted to expand its social agenda by advocating national health insurance. So there was an American Association of non-governmental, and these were workers and individuals saying, we want the government to take responsibility for our health services. But in 1917, that got thwarted. Franklin Roosevelt included health benefits or health services or health coverage, money to pay for health services for all Americans in the New Deal. Got thwarted. And then in 1940, it failed, unfortunately. Slide 25, Harry Truman proposed national health insurance. Didn't go through. 1940 to 1992, not much happened around this. But in 1992, the Clinton and Bush proposals proposed national health insurance or national health programs. But polls showed significant fear of loss of coverage and problems with receiving services. Now, this is now the spread lobbying efforts on the behalf of employers and employees and physicians and things like that, and insurance companies all got in there, and basically fear for losing out from multiple fronts killed it. So why, on slide number 26, this is a really good one, good slide too. Why won't national health insurance or health plans pass? Well, politics, it's an economic and political issue in our country. And anything that's political takes time, takes a long time. It's not fast. Look at the Affordable Care Act. It was passed relatively quickly in our history. And look at how much trouble people got in around that because they didn't fully understand it, they didn't read it, there just wasn't enough time taken to understand what they were passing. So political inexpediency definitely thwarts it. Institutional dissimilarities is number 2 on slide number 26. Organizations, where's my marker? Institutional dissimilarities. There are competing objectives for all the organizations involved in today's healthcare in the United States. Employers have a set of objectives. Physicians have a set of objectives. Hospitals do. legislators do, the government as a whole does. There's just, I usually use a triangle, and we can even make it a star and even more, but you've got employers, you've got government, you've got hospitals, you've got doctors, you've got insurance companies, you've got, I don't know, others out there. There's just so many, I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's so many organizations involved that it's really, really hard to find an equal balance where everybody wins, because we're at a point where someone's got to lose. So, for example, even in hospital systems these days, if you would, let's say manufacturers, if somehow you'd nationalize, let's say healthcare, and they start PET scanners or MRI scanners or something like that. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the greater metro areas, we have about 1.6 million people. Statistically, you can figure out how many X pieces of equipment you need to meet the need of those people. I don't know the exact number, but I bet MRIs, we probably have, we have a lot more MRIs in our market than we really, really need. Because hospitals have purchased them to have a strategic or competitive advantage against another hospital. If somehow they got nationalized and would mandate how many pictures could be taken or something like that, well, okay, the hospital may be, well, what do I do with the piece of equipment that I already have? Well, okay, that goes on. But we happen to also be in the area where GE Medical lives out in the Waukesha area. How do you think GE Medical is going to feel if all of a sudden we're buying less MRI machines from them? Not so good, because they employ a ton of people, and those people need jobs and want jobs, and what happens to those jobs if all of a sudden you don't need their MRIs anymore? Well, again, it's complicated. There's so many competing institutional dissimilarities between them. So we have that as well. And then ideological differences. Is healthcare a right or a privilege? We talked about that even in the discussion questions. Is it a right or a privilege? Is it a market justice issue or a social justice issue? You can answer that for yourself, and you're probably right. But there's someone who disagrees with you, and they feel they're right. And right now, it's politically divisive in some ways. And then tax aversion. One thing everybody agrees on is that if we're going to do nationalized health, anything, taxes would have to go up. And no one likes paying more taxes. Now, one could make rational arguments saying, well, okay, Rob, you're paying $1,700 a month. Well, I'm going to pay $1,700 a month no matter what. What if that money just went in a form of a tax instead, and then I got health services? Maybe that would be good. I don't know. But there's a fundamental dislike of being taxed in our country. And in general, the goal is to reduce taxes or keep taxes flat. And that's a tough one for everybody. So there's a tax aversion. So when we go through slides 27, 28, 29, 30, I give some examples of what political expediency is. For example, on slide 27, there's no threat to U.S. political instability right now. Germany and England were social insurance had, it was a way to get worker loyalty. They used insurance to get worker loyalty. Way back when, in the 19-teens, our government tried to get hold of it because they did want loyalty for workers, and they did want to do it. And our folks said, no, don't want that. We moved away from that. And then you can read through those slides on the reasons why they weren't interested in it. So now I'm moving forward to Medicare and Medicaid on slide 32. Before 1965, only private insurance was widely available. Well, in 1965, the Social Security Amendments made Medicare and Medicaid national programs. What we did is they nationalized care for certain subsets of Americans, the old and the poor. The thing was that set formalized a tiered system. So in general, private pay or government pay or private pay or employer-based covered people, you had those plans, and then you had the government plans, Medicare and Medicaid. And even from the get-go, the government plans paid less than the private ones. So there's been a discrepancy from the beginning, and it continues. Healthcare institutions today get less money for the same service. They get less from Medicare than they would, let's say, from Aetna or another payer. It's becoming less of a discrepancy as everything gets really expensive, and commercial insurers tend to follow what Medicare does. But I guess that's beside the point. The poor and elderly, up until 1965, the poor and elderly had to rely on their own resources or charity to get services if they fell on hard times. But we made it an entitlement in 1965. So on slide 33, it talks about some precursors to Medicare and Medicaid. You can look at that. In Medicare, Part A is for hospitals. Part B is for physicians and outpatient stuff. Part C is managed care, and Part D is for drugs. So just know about that. Medicaid or Title 19, it's a program that's managed at the state level, and it just is. It's managed at the state level, but it uses federal matching funds. So it's for the poor, and it's based on means testing developed by each state. That's why Medicaid programs are different from one state to one state to one state to one state. Wisconsin happens to be a pretty robust and generous state when it comes to Medicaid, relatively compared. I've lived in Arizona and I've lived in Florida, and I got to tell you, for all the foibles and problems that Wisconsin had, it's still generally a generous state for those low-income folks. So now I'm going to prototypes of managed care on slide number 38. Different types of managed care. We're talking about contract practices, group practices, and prepaid group plans. Contract practices. Capitation. So this is something you got to know. Capitation. Think of the guillotine, decapitation, off with their head. Well, capitation is amount of money per head, where a contract with an independent physician or a hospital is a flat rate or a certain amount per head, like per member per month, to cover all the healthcare services within that contract. And generally, physicians can be salaried or paid flat fees on that. These capitation replaces fee for service. Fee for service is the market precedent, where I'm Dr. Rob, I provide you a service, you pay me my fee. Well, capitation is Dr. Rob agrees to provide you a service for a specific amount of money that was previously agreed upon, so capitation. The AMA has approved contract practices in remote areas like railroad, mining, lumber, and enterprises, but in general, I guess that's a contract practice. So what's a group practice? A group practice is when you get a group of physicians, you bring them together with business managers and technicians in a division of labor. So it seems it's seen as a threat to general practitioners because of because they become competitive and they can do more, be more efficient, and put the individual practitioners out of business, basically. So it is seen as a threat, and it's solo practitioners don't like group practices. The truth of the matter today, and this is being recorded in 2018, is that there's very, very, very few solo practices left. There are a few, mostly among the super subspecialists, but generally finding a solo primary care doc is pretty hard. So group practices have become the standard. And then prepaid group plans. The AMA opposed prepaid group plans, because, well, what is a prepaid group plan? Prepaid group plan is sort of a blending. It's where a group is paid a flat amount for physicians to pay an amount to cover a certain population. The very first ones were seen as in violation of antitrust, meaning that it reduced competition and it protected the providers too much, so to speak, and we the consumers were at risk. But they soon started offering comprehensive services through organized and generally specialist physicians. So the physicians started to organize among themselves and start organizing and negotiating back with insurance companies. So in essence, the goal was, instead of having the insurance company drive it, physicians ended up driving it. And we ended up getting them anyway. So what do you need to know about the HMO Act of 1973? In 1973, the federal government recognized that more money needed to go into managing healthcare instead of providing healthcare. Subtle difference there. So the reason why is, remember, Medicare and Medicaid has been around for almost 10 years. More people are getting eligible, so more services are being provided, and the government is getting an idea of the costs, the escalating costs of healthcare, especially under their covered populations. And they're like, oh my gosh, that's when they started to realize that eventually Medicare and Medicaid is going to go bankrupt. So in 1973, they passed the HMO Act, where federal funds were made available to expand HMOs, so health maintenance organizations, which were basically prepaid medical plans, in order to slow down and manage the spending in a better way. And that's where it started talking about prospective payment, capitated plans, things like that. The Act failed to achieve its objective back in 1973 because employers, they said, don't worry about it. As long as employers were saying, as long as we can stay really, really busy and keep earning all this money, employers will continue to contribute toward healthcare expenditures and be paying taxes and basically shoveling money into the healthcare bucket or furnace for the government. Because remember, Medicare and Medicaid, which are government programs, are funded through taxes. So the employers were like, well, no, we're going to continue to do well, and don't worry about it. Well, we should have worried about it, I guess. So now moving into the corporate era of healthcare, so 1900s to present. The government, I'm on slide number 43, the government, through its General Agreement on Trade and Services in 1995, the intention was to remove barriers to international trade and services. It's been identified that the United States in general is less competitive on the world market because of, it costs more to do stuff here. Like, for example, insurance and healthcare costs are way more expensive here than, let's say, in Mexico or China or wherever. And in the 90s, realizing that the world is our market, and we need to and want to compete on that market, the government decided we're going to work on reducing any barriers to international trade. And what does that mean to healthcare? Well, it would affect health insurance, how it's issued, what's covered, what's not, hospital services, where can you get services. There was a period of time I used to work for a very large hospital system, and this actually still happens, is that they built some offshore medical centers, so where there'd be specialists and controlled, and you'd go and have a certain procedure done there because it would get done less expensively and managed, and then you come home. Other people from other countries come to the United States and have that done because the quality is better here, and they can afford it. But telemedicine, medical treatments abroad, the reduction of international trade has opened up the world for entrepreneurial and I guess people comfortable with the risk of trying to do something on the world level and not just inside our country. The corporate era of healthcare has three main features. One, it's a corporatization, so it's maintaining corporations' hold on healthcare provision, healthcare service, healthcare organization, and financing. It's also information on how services are used and all that kind of stuff. Information is key these days. Electronic health, electronic medical records, health data, trading, all that kind of stuff. Analyzing the data in order to get the best outcome at the lowest cost is huge. Economies of scale, the goal to achieve economies of scale is a big driving force. So having control of the data and the information is key. And again, just globalization. The world is your market. Medical care has become the domain of large corporations because they can afford high tech. They can build centers and systems all over the place. Cost control. The problem is that we haven't controlled the costs. We're trying to slow them down. The costs continue to go up and up and up, and we're still struggling with that. So hospital systems, for example, have created integrated health delivery systems where hospitals just get bigger and bigger and bigger, or hospital systems get bigger and bigger and bigger. But I put this out to you is that we're not really a system in our country, because even here in Milwaukee, we have multiple hospital systems competing with each other. If it were truly a system, it would balance itself out, but we're not there. In order for one hospital system to do better, another one has to do not as well. And we're just not quite there yet. So I guess you can read slide 42 as well. I already talked about this. There's an information revolution, telemedicine and telehealth, e-health, all that kind of stuff. Our computing power and our ability to capture and report on and analyze data continues to go up. There's a body of knowledge out there that says that we're collecting more data and storing it for future. Well, we have more data collected than we can analyze in any of our individual lifetimes, and that as we get better at analyzing data, I've heard of metadata and things like stuff like that, that we'll go back and analyze stuff historically once we, figure out some revolutionary or evolutionary connection or correlation. But we're capturing gobs and gobs and gobs and gobs of data. Now, the other side, though, is from a consumer standpoint. There's the deprofessionalization of healthcare providers. That should sound familiar because that's one of our Causal Loop projects. That so much data is being made available to consumers that it's not unusual for someone to show up at the physician's office, with a ream of information saying, I have this disease and this is my treatment protocol. Doc, write me a prescription. Well, they might be right, but what if they're not? the takeaway there is that there's lots and lots of data and information out there, but we're not 100% sure if it's all good or how much of it is good or anything like that. So consumers beware. Also drives physicians nuts. Some physicians nuts because it reduces their ability to be the doctor. Let's see. On slide 46, it just talks about globalization and what that means. The final, in corporate medicine, globalization has both positive and negative consequences. It just does. Which then moves us into the era of healthcare reform. So now we're actively trying to reform healthcare, and we have been for the last 8-9 years. I guess we've been trying at it longer, but one of the first attempts was around children. Again, a subset, not everybody, but around a subset of people, which are children, which was Chip, the Children's Health Insurance Program in 1997. Medicare prescription drugs, so Medicare Part D in 2003, was healthcare reform around adding prescription drugs to Medicare. Before that, there was no prescription drug program. The Affordable Care Act, state precedents. The Affordable Care Act was a federal endeavor, but it wasn't actually a new idea. On slide number 49, there's some examples, or there's two examples. The Oregon Health Plan, which came out in the late 1980s, and then there was the Massachusetts Health Plan, which came out in 2006. And if you look at these things, you might even want to look at this as you're getting ready to do the causal loop analysis on the Affordable Care Act articles, is that that some of the stuff was tried before on state levels with some success, with some failures, but it was tried before. And then the Affordable Care Act was the federal opportunity on that. So the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010. There wasn't, it was very, very partisan. Not one single Republican voted for it. President Obama united his own party behind the legislation and pushed it through, or moved it through. What's interesting, though, is that this goes back to governmental expediency. History had shown that things can be debated to death. So one could look at what the administration did and completely sympathize and empathize. It's like, get it through, because if not, it'll take years just to analyze what we're doing. So just get it through. And they did, and then the AMA originally came out against it, but then they revised their stance and decided to support it after they analyzed portions of it. The American public was kept in the dark about the details. They really were, but I would say the legislators, this is Rob's opinion, the legislators were in the dark about the details too. It is and was a really complicated document. There's still legal challenges to it. The Supreme Court ruled, took them a few years, but ruled that the majority of ACA's provisions were constitutional under Congress's power to tax, which is the individual mandate. So it turned out that the Affordable Care Act, the majority of it, was legal. There was a time when people were saying it's not legal, but the Supreme Court did say that the majority of it was. However, the federal government couldn't coerce the states to expand their existing Medicaid programs under it. So they could do taxation at the federal level, but they couldn't mandate what the states would do. And here in Wisconsin, it was an incredibly volatile and debated point, and still is, because the state of Wisconsin did not participate in the Medicaid expansion. And there's a whole book of history on that as well. But that's just kind of interesting. So opposition continues. I'm on the last slide. The Obama administration delayed implementation of the employer mandate until 2015. So it went from 2010 to 2015 before the employer was mandated to participate. The law has been implemented, many of the provisions have been implemented since 2010, but implementation challenges still continue, and it's being tweaked as we speak. So, all right, so that takes us through the slides, and I'm going to take the next about 20 minutes, and I'm going to share with you what you can, what you need to think about for the quiz on chapter 3. So I've got some notes here, but so you want to know what prevented the government from ever implementing a nationally run healthcare program. Why? Why does it not work in our country? Where does in those eras? Know that slide. Slide number 7. What was the driving force in each of those eras? For example, in pre-industrial America, what was the driving force? What did medicine look like? Was it really corporate? Was it domestic? Was it something else? What was it? We've been through a cycle where in pre-industrial America, it was very much market-based. You needed care, you sought care, you paid for care, and hopefully you lived. And then we've gone through corporatization like crazy, and now we're moving into healthcare reform, and just know what the differences in those and what it looks like. Interesting. There's just some fun facts in there. In the pre-industrial era talks about what was a hospital, who was a doctor back then. Like for instance, barbers were surgeons. They just were. Almshouses were the equivalent of hospitals. Dispensaries were the equivalent of outpatient care centers. Just get a feel for that kind of stuff. Let's see. Oh, know what a pest house is? I'm tossing that one out there. You have almshouses, you have pest houses. In the pre-industrial period, most people couldn't afford the services of qualified physicians. Why? Why couldn't they? There were some physicians around in the pre-industrial area, but if you think about where they were in the development of our country, what was the reason why consumers, I would say, in the territory of Wisconsin, why they wouldn't take advantage of seeing a doctor that was enrolled in one of the medical schools out east. Let's see. In the pre-industrial era, who built asylums and the precursors to hospitals? Who took responsibility for those folks? That'd be good to know. Let's see. Spend some time figuring out and reading about the medical schools before, the evolution of medical schools. There's a couple of good sections, even on the slides. Take a look at that. But in the book, take a look at that. How did they get to know that? Know what urbanization is. That's a good one. Know what cultural authority is, because I use that word. That's a good word, and where it came from. Know about, get a good feel for the development of professionalism among physicians. Going from people riding around on horses and wagons, giving out their elixirs to now, the pinnacle. I would even say today, the pinnacle of cultural authority and economic power in at least the medical realm. Understand that. Know about the American Medical Association and what their history is and what their role is. Why don't you take a look at the Flexner Report of 1910. What did they do? The U.S. Supreme Court, the deinstitutionalization of folks with mental health. I talked about that just a few minutes ago. in the slides, but what act and what acts were passed for the government on deinstitutionalization? In the U.S., public health. Why didn't private practitioners just totally buy into public health? Why did they? Why did it require a completely separate development of a process to deal with public health issues? Let's see. Know about workers' compensation. Talked about that. What was the purpose of private health insurance? Why did it even come about? Why did Blue Cross only cover hospitals? Why didn't Blue Cross cover physicians? That'd be a good thing to know. During World War II, health insurance became employer-based. Remember we talked about that? Why is that? I mean, some employers were covering it before that, but almost all employers adopted it during World War II. This is a good one. There's some political reasons why nationalized health insurance works or health services works in other countries. Specifically in Germany and England, there's a couple spots in the book that talks about Germany and England. Why did national health care work and the government push for it in Germany and England? That's a good thing to know. Who is the first American president to make an appeal for national health insurance? You should know that. Know the role of the AMA. Get a feel for why middle-class Americans don't like national health insurance. Why was Medicare and Medicaid formed? What are some of the problems with Medicare and Medicaid, especially in the eyes of the physician? What effect has managed care? Remember the HMO movement that started and it's kind of moved on. But what is a major effect of managed care across the board in delivery settings? What e-health we just talked about. Know what deprofessionalization is and its link to e-health. Let's see. On the quiz, there's a bunch of true falses as well. So know that. But so that's a good overview of what you need for the quiz. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my little camera here and try to, hope you can read that. On my screen it looks backwards, so I hope it's forwards for you. But what I did is, here I'm going to try to move it closer. So be patient with me, please. Hope I don't get anybody seasick. The lighting isn't perfect, great in here, but what I tried to show here, hopefully it'll show up, right, is that I took professional sovereignty of the physician as the issue that I want to analyze. So if you looked at the slides that I posted that explains what should go into your project, this was the issue, professional sovereignty, and then the behaviors or traits as described as nouns that I put in there. I chose urbanization, patient volume, physician income, and specialization. And this is my main loop right here. So what I'm saying is that, professional sovereignty. We can start anywhere, but as physicians increase in their specialization, it has a positive, so that's a plus, effect on a physician's professional sovereignty. It improves their position of authority. As that happens, their income goes up. As incomes go up among docs, it increases specialization among physicians. So that is a positive loop, reinforcing itself over and over and over again. So that's my one loop there. Now, I wanted to take into account what effect does that have on patients. So I took patient volume. Well, as we're building professional sovereignty, specialization, all that kind of stuff, as physicians, as they're acknowledged sovereigns or experts or value in the system, patient volume goes up, has a positive effect. Why? Because patients want to go to the best. And in our country, that's supported. I don't know about you, but if my grandma has something wrong with her, I want her to have the best specialist possible because I want Nana to do well. I would bet you would too, or your child, or my child. I definitely want the best. So I find out who the best is, either by word of mouth or objective data. Well, me and all my friends, we want to go there. So patient volumes will go up. Now because of that, what effect does higher patient volume have on physician income? Well, it's positive. Because in general, especially in this day, we still have incentive payments. You can't have kickbacks, that's illegal. Can't do that. But there are performance metrics that reward putting in the extra whatever. So it's not uncommon to have some portion of your salary, your reimbursement, your work performance-based. So we have that. So that increases physician incomes, which then goes back into the cycle why more people want to be specialists. So, okay, then I took urbanization. This was interesting. So what market effect has, something completely unrelated to, you would think, medicine. I'm trying to tip it so you can see it. Hang on. Let me adjust a little bit. Thank you for your patience as I work my audio-visual tools. So up here, things related to urbanization. Roads, cars, phones, towns. You'd think, what does that have to do with the sovereignty or the recognized importance of physicians? Just wait, it does. Look, now thinking back to industrial times or post-industrial times, as roads became more developed and paved better, more cars rode on those roads, bringing more people into towns, and it brought phones and towns and all the things. They're all positive. So urban aspects of urbanization is also a positive reinforcing loop. So it's a causal loop with positive polarity. So as your towns get bigger, more roads are built, more cars come in, more phones are made, more towns developed. It goes around and around and around. All that is urbanization. What that does, though, is that it actually increases provider sovereignty, especially physician sovereignty. And let me tell you how and why. Phones is probably the biggest stretch there. Consulting. The advent of telephones allowed physicians from one place to call physicians in another place to get their opinion. Specialization. Primary care calls a specialist, gets an opinion. The value of that sovereign physician goes up. Urbanization. Remember in the slides we were talking about there was a gathering or a collecting of expertise in urban areas. Remember Johns Hopkins, Harvard, those hospitals, those were urbanly developing. Urban areas in fast development made it easier for people to get there, the collection of information to get there, patients to get there, because more people started moving into those areas. So it kept going up. So urbanization has a positive driving force, positive, not good or bad, but positive, growing driving force on professional sovereignty because of all the trappings. Because then you say you have more people living in those towns, you have more specialized folks there, then all of a sudden it also affects patient volume. Because there are more people living in the town, the doc doesn't have to travel to go see him, and the people don't have to travel as far to find the expert. So that's an example of a causal loop for professional sovereignty. So now, the only thing that would be missing on this, other than the write-up, which we should probably do, is that on your project, what you'd want to do is have this here, but then I suggest you write your, in noun format, write your elements and show, what the relationship is to sovereignty. Is it positive? Is it negative? Maybe you don't know, which is fine too. I just have to explain what effect it might or might not have, depending upon what you want in your write-up. So you do that, and then over time, on this one, I could have done a time graph from, let's say, 1900 to today, and this is professional sovereignty. It's a generally upward curve. See here I have time on the x-axis, professional sovereignty levels on the y-axis, and it's going up. And ideally I would show it, but then in my write-up I'd explain the effects all the way around. So I hope that helps. That's chapter 3. Please offer some feedback. Hope you have a good day. Thanks.